Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to another episode of our Daanish TV English language channel, sponsored by the Center for Muslim World Studies. And today, I'm incredibly excited to welcome an incredibly dear friend, and much more than that, also a mentor for me over the years, Professor Omid Safi, who I affectionately call Omid Bhai. So please pardon me if I call him Omid Bhai throughout the conversation. But just a little bit about Professor Omid Safi. He is certainly one of the leading Muslim intellectuals in the world, in my humble opinion, and I won't let him deny that. And he did his PhD from Duke University. He has been associated now with Duke University for quite a while. He was the director of the Graduate Study of Islamic Studies there at Duke University. And just on a very personal note, Professor Omid Safi perhaps single-handedly, and this is no exaggeration, even though folks will claim that I tend to exaggerate at times, but Professor Omid Safi has enabled and facilitated an entire generation of young Muslim scholars to enter the field of Islamic studies in a discipline where we had Western, largely non-Muslim scholars, Orientalist scholars, for better or worse, not all of them, biased in the way that, say, for example, Edward Said criticized them. But what Professor Omid Safi has done has really mentored and nurtured countless young Muslims who before may have been, and he can perhaps even share some of his own personal trajectory in this regard, may have gone into engineering or medical school and so on. But Professor Omid Safi's own inspirational life trajectory, particularly in the post 9/11 context, in confronting the various issues that were emerging that Muslims were required to respond to. I think that in some ways, following Professor Omid Safi in both my own personal capacity, in terms of the academic lists and so on, one can easily see that Omid Bhai has enabled and facilitated and has been so generous with his time in enabling, in mentoring young Muslims to enter the field of Islamic studies. And by now, alhamdulillah, in the United States, in the North American Academy, and perhaps throughout the world, the impact I cannot understate of Professor Omid Safi in inspiring, in guiding, and in mentoring young Muslim scholars, including myself. And so I wanted to give that very personal note because I think it's incredibly important, and it has, in my opinion, radically transformed the way that the entire kind of academic approach to Islam, in not just in a very narrow sense of what we considered classical Orientalist Islamic studies, but in a very interdisciplinary way in approaching the field. This is the contribution of the man that we have today with us, and so that's why it's a very special occasion. And I just wanted to say thank you and Assalamu alaikum, Professor Omid Safi.
Wa alaikum assalam, Junaid Bhai. Thank you so very much for those very generous and heartfelt words. Even if I don't live up to the extent of the praise, I certainly do take the kindness and the goodness with which they're said to heart. And You and I both know that nothing good and beautiful in life is ever accomplished single-handedly, and that
Yes.
it always takes a movement and it always takes a community. And I think at the end of the day, that's what any of us are trying to do, is to remind ourselves that we're not doomed to
Yes.
be alone, and that we can actually be in community with one another, that life and joy and success are not a zero-sum game, that as our dear brother Edward Said used to say, quoting Amy Cesar, there is room for all at the rendezvous of victory, and that togetherness and unity and sisterhood and brotherhood is one of the sweetest fruits of this kind of communal work. To love one another, to encourage one another, to push one another, to support one another, and to pick ourselves up when we fall down,
Yes.
which is also inevitable in the journey of
Absolutely.
this life. So thank you, and I'm honored to have you as a friend and as a colleague and as a fellow worker in the cause of love and justice in this world.
Thank you, Omid Bhai. Yes, and I take your words very, very seriously, but there's no question that you have played a pivotal role in in creating this community, in being a part of a community that has, in fact, what you just said, tried to establish this sense of love and justice and the struggle to achieve that. So thank you very much, Omid Bhai. And we have a certain period of time that we want to get. We want to pick your brain on a few topics,
Hmm.
and it's, as I was saying to you before, even though it is becoming a bit overwhelming for the world to be to be almost nonstop, 24/7 focused on what is going on in the United States right now with regard to the elections and general American political culture. Uh, I did not want to spend too much time on that because your knowledge and the erudition on so many other issues I really wanted to get to, but I can't help but just begin with this very briefly. Your reflections, Professor Umid Safi, about what is the state of American political culture right now? What is going on, and how did we get to this point?
Well, I think what you're seeing in the United States right now is a dystopian nightmare.
Mm, mm,
And because we do live in this globalized world of images and sound bites, the temptation is to always view politics as a kind of reality TV,
yeah.
as the greatest and the grandest of deceptions. And of course, when the charlatans who are in power
Mm,
themselves come from that world of reality TV with no
yes.
qualifications, no background in service, no erudition, no love and dedication towards humanity, but for having been a TV host,
Yes.
and almost a buffoonish caricature of themselves. It's not surprising that politics and entertainment, or what passes as entertainment, um, sensationalist, tantalizing, begin to mirror one another. I
Yes.
want to get beyond the point of this almost single handed obsession with individual figures, as tempting as it might be to remain obsessed with a cruel narcissist like Trump, who is a full on enabler of white supremacy
Yeah.
and fascist authoritarian tendencies.
Absolutely.
Um, but I think the wiser thing to do is to zoom back far enough and ask the questions of systems and structures and institutions. And
Yes.
in many ways, once we do that, then we're beyond the world of familiar figures like Trump and Biden, and even people that I might have a lot more affection for, like Bernie Sanders,
Right.
or even to see Trump as a kind of reaction and response to America's first Muslim president, Barack
Right.
Hussein Obama. And I say that tongue in cheek.
Right.
But to really ask the question of, as you said, how do we get here?
Yeah.
And I think what we're noticing is a combination of factors. You are noticing an overextended empire, right? On one
Yes.
hand, all empires are doomed to collapse. Whether it is Rome or the Persian Empire or the Mongol Empire or the British Empire, the French Empire, and now the American Empire. Empires, by definition, do not last permanently.
Yes.
And in the case of the American Empire, and that's what America is and has been for a few generations, and anyone who doesn't see that is not cognizant of the fact that there's one country and one country alone in the world which has military bases on the soil of over 100 other countries. No other nation on the planet gets to live like this. No other nation on the planet has 20% of her children living in poverty, 40% of her Black and Brown and Native American children living in poverty, and continue to spend more on the military every year than the next 12 countries combined. This is not the behavior of a healthy, functioning, democratic society. In the words of Dr. King, this is a society gone mad on war. Gone mad on war. So I think partially what you're noticing in America, Junaid Bhai, is a society which is severely mal-educated. You wouldn't be able to have politicians and policymakers talk about wearing of masks in an age of coronavirus as a restriction of their freedom at a time when there's almost 300,000 preventable deaths in this country alone.
Correct.
You wouldn't be able to have someone who lies in the highest office in the land so repeatedly and so frequently about everything from issues of who actually won the election,
right,
to global warming, to basic issues of geography,
yes,
and not have the vast majority of people in the country go, this is insane. This is simply not factually true. So on one hand, what we're noticing is a society that has refused, not through bureaucratic mistakes, but through deliberate and willful choice, refused to invest in its infrastructure,
yes,
refused to invest in education, refused to invest in healthcare, in taking care of its babies, taking care of its sick, taking care of its elderly, of having adequate parental leave policies.
That's right.
Having spent a good amount of my life, alhamdulillah, in the global south, I'm mindful of the fact that from the perspective of the global south, the US is seen as a society with an unimaginable wealth that has been obtained through plundering the riches of the rest of the world. And that's certainly true. Empires are in the business of plunder and exploitation. What I think sometimes from the rest of the world's perspective, it's harder to appreciate is that the United States is also the country, and we see this in Pakistan, unfortunately, we see this in Iran, we see this in many other countries in the part of the world that you and I both love. But there is no other society in the world with a greater gap between those that have everything and the absolutely have-nots. So while it's true that the United States is an empire, while it's true that the United States is a corrupt, militaristic force of suffering at a global scale, it is also true that among the many victims of the United States are about half of her own citizens.
Yes.
Which includes Black and brown citizens, Muslim citizens, Hispanics, and the poor.
Yes.
What we are noticing now under this Trump dystopia is not a nightmare that is caused by one person. We're noticing the result of decades and decades of investment in the military-industrial complex.
That's right.
And neglect of basic human needs. So to go back again to one of those prophetic religious voices, and I'm using the word prophetic in the English sense, not in the Islamic sense. We're not talking about someone who is receiving revelation. We're talking about people whose love of God leads them to a deep concern for the suffering of the poor, the needy, the orphan, the widow, right? And Dr. King is, in that sense, the most important prophetic voice that America has produced in this last century. And his response was a society that continues to spend more on war than it spends on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Spiritual death. So what is happening in America? We are noticing a society that is approaching spiritual death. And on one hand, we want to continue to speak truth. We want to continue to speak truth to power and say the way that America is organized, our priorities, our impact on the rest of the world simply cannot stand. It is not only harmful, it is amplifying death and suffering over many parts of the world, and in particular, Black and brown regions of the world. At the same time, and I think here's one of the ways in which I always try to encourage my comrades from the left to hang on to that prophetic and religious message, which is our fundamental hope. And there's one thing that is forbidden for us, and that's despair. We are called to be a people of hope.
Yes.
We're told in the Quran to never give up hope of God's mercy. We have hope that even a militaristic empire can repent. That even the United States can right its way and come to be a responsible member of the world community. And that would mean a radical reorganization of our values.
Right. Thank you, Omid Bhai, for that very concise and quite incisive assessment of where America is at, how it has gotten here, and how we can perhaps hang on to that hope in terms of transforming the United States through our social movements, through civil society, and through precisely those communities that you speak about that we are trying to create within the United States. So I want to simultaneously go to another issue that, of course, has arisen. And of course, that has been the issue of what has gone on with once again, the republication of cartoons caricaturing the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the ensuing statements by the French president Macron, and as well as the horrific individual killings by some Muslims, some violence by some Muslims against individuals in France and so on, and the larger uh, uh, outrage that has emerged within the Muslim world, which is, of course, not new. It has, in some ways can be traced back to all the way to Salman Rushdie affair with the publication of the satanic verses. In today's world, in the digital media, we now have cartoons and so on. And I really wanted to have you address this question because one of your really impressive and outstanding works that I assigned to my students. Your work, Memories of Muhammad, Why the Prophet Matters. And I can't think of a title of a book that would be more appropriate to, in some ways, unpack what is going on right now, why the anger, which may be pretty straightforward, of many Muslims, and but more importantly, I remember, Professor Omid Safi, you would have a blog which I would and my students and I would read very regularly about what would the Prophet do. And that was incredibly inspiring because there were just a number of events that would and developments that would occur in the world, and your in very incisive kind of uh, evaluation of kind of the prophetic tradition and the prophetic practice, and what you surmise that what the Prophet, peace be upon him, would do in such an occasion. And so I want you to kind of share some of your reflections on this now kind of fiasco that has emerged, and what kind of how should Muslims be responding to this issue?
Thank you, Junaid Bhai. So let's just begin, perhaps not with the post-colonial, if there is a post in the colonial, but actually from the depth of our spiritual and religious imagination. And let's begin by asserting something that we all know to be true in our hearts, which is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is so dear to God Almighty that God himself said that the whole of the creation, seen and unseen, was created for his sake. Whatever some buffoonish Danish or French cartoonist does, they cannot touch the outskirt of the robe of the Prophet. They do not breathe the same air as his luminous rank. So to begin with, what they are mocking and insulting is actually not our beloved Prophet. It is their own imagination. In a real sense, they are mocking themselves, and we do not have to take their mockery to heart. And I want to emphasize the fact that when someone is holding vile poison in their hand, do not take it into your heart, right? Their own worst curse is that which they themselves are generating, and they will have to answer for it in a much higher court.
Yes.
So to begin that, let us always continue to insist not only that our beloved Hazrat Payghambar is not a terrorist and not a this and not a that, but let's talk about who and what he is. He is Rahmatun lil Alameen. He's a mercy to all the worlds. As God is Rabbul Alameen, the Lord of all the worlds, the Prophet is a mercy to all the worlds. Let's talk about who he is, rather than always defining it in the negative. So, period, full stop.
Yes.
And certain Europeans love to pose these inconsistent positions for their religious and ethnic minorities, which is that if you want to be a part of our empire, then we have to have the right to insult that which you hold most dear. Now,
Right.
even Europeans themselves don't actually hold the notion of absolute freedom of speech because, of course, most European countries have laws against mocking the Holocaust. And their sense is, well, that's too far, and rightly so. Only a
Right.
cruel-hearted person would mock the suffering of people who've lost loved ones in the Holocaust. But it goes to show you that even the freedom of speech there is not absolute.
Right.
Jyllands-Posten, the same Danish magazine that first published these horrific cartoons, had refused to publish cartoons mocking Christ. And no one should mock Christ. No one should mock any of God's messengers and prophets on the basis that Danish people are Christian, majority, and that they would be offended. So what we're really talking about is not satire, and satire has a glorious tradition
Yes.
in Europe as it does in Islam.
Yes.
Satire can be a powerful tool for speaking truth to power, right?
Yes.
In South Asia, almost every educated person used to read Sadi's Rose Garden, and there's wonderful lines of satire in there. A tyrannical king goes to a Sufi and says, pray for me. And he's like, oh, you really wouldn't want me to. He's like, no, I'm the king. I command you. And he's like, okay, fine. God, kill him. And the king is like, what the hell kind of prayer is that? And he's like, by he in whose hand is my soul, this would be best. It would prevent you from accumulating sins, and it would liberate humanity from your tyranny. Right?
Wow.
We have these wonderful lines and teachings in our foundational sources. When it comes to the modern European context, we don't have a political satire in this case that is about exposing hypocrisy and speaking truth to power.
Right.
What we have is a bullying of ethnic and religious minorities who, this is not some random choice. These are the children of the colonies. Why do we have Tunisians and Moroccans and Algerians in France? Why do we have Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in the UK? Because you colonized us.
Right.
Your ethnic and religious minorities, your visible others, are the fruit of your process of colonialism. We didn't want to be here. But again, as our late brother Edward Said says, once you have colonialism, the colonial metropole and the colonized people are linked together. Like it or not, we're bound together. So the real question is, now that we're bound together, is it going to be based on respect? Is it going to be based on coexistence? Or is it going to be based on an arrogant model, as we hear from Macron right now, that French secularism should entitle X, Y, and Z, and that even the European colonial and at times very racist nation state should be in charge of interpreting and implementing visions of Islam. Well, the minute you stop colonizing the world, the minute you stop treating your own citizens with racism, maybe is the day that we will even entertain the thought of having the nation state be in charge of interpreting religion. And by the way, whether the conversation is in Iran or in Pakistan or in Turkey or in France or anywhere in the world, something quite dangerous happens when a nation state is in charge of interpreting and implementing religion. What happens to the power of religion to speak truth to power when those in power are themselves in charge of interpreting religion? In my prophetic commitment, religious communities do best when we're standing just outside the corridors of power, not when we have been fully co-opted into the system. This is not a call for quietism. This is not a call for withdrawing from society. Far from it. I think religious voices belong at the center of the public square. Absolutely. But I'm very distrustful of any nation state, particularly those that have competed with England for colonizing Black and brown people when it comes to claiming the mantle of enlightenment or civilization or interpreting
Right.
religion.
Right. And I couldn't agree with you more, Professor Omid Safi, particularly the point that you made that there is that rich tradition of satire, but the idea historically has always been the satire directed toward the powerful,
That's right.
towards the powerful and to challenging the powerful. What we have today is that the most marginalized groups of society, that they are being targeted
That's
with
right.
satire, the ones that don't have the power, the powerless. And so that is a fundamental difference that people don't comprehend when they say that, well, there's this free speech, absolute free speech, and we have this long tradition of satire, but they get it wrong. The target of that satire was to actually challenge these institutions of power that were oppressing the population, rather than what we see today, the most marginalized elements, as you point out, these post-colonial peoples within France, within England, and so on, and they are at the receiving end, at the brunt of this satire. So that's I think a very crucial point. I think that you emphasize and that we should understand about this thing. One other thing, Omid Bhai, you had mentioned about you mentioned the Sufis, and of course, it's important to mention. I want to tell the audience that Professor Omid Safi's one of his areas of expertise is the Tasawwuf tradition and Sufism and so on. And there has been this kind of mantra after post 9/11, constant mantra of the kind of the division, the bifurcation between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. And the bad Muslim, of course, are basically all the other Muslims that are not Sufis,
Right.
that don't believe in kind of the kind of the Rumi-esque, the certain version of Rumi that is offered.
Yeah.
In some ways, the Western co-optation of the tradition of say Rumi and other great Sufi scholars. And so I wanted you to speak just very briefly to this very distorted version of what the Sufi tradition has been about, and has it just been about peace-loving, passive, quietist, individuals, whirling dervishes, and so on, or has there been another tradition in which they have spoken against and resisted power?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And yes, of course, we all know the old colonial games of divide and conquer. And there seems to be no end to this, and no end to the ways in which we keep falling for this. So whether it is those of us with really good progressive politics and the rest of those Muslims over there, or whether it's those of us who are the good Sufis and then those big bad scary folks over there, there's this constant game of dividing us against ourselves. And I think it's very important to always be mindful of whose interest is being served by these tactics of division. When it comes to the Sufi tradition, this is as central to our way of relating to God and humanity as any other interpretation of Islam out there.
Right.
The Sufi tradition that I study and I've spent my life devoted to, this was in a recent book of mine that I published called Radical Love. And that's actually the way that I most like to translate these Arabic, Persian, Urdu terms, ishq, radical love. And I like having that radical sense kind of in there, that this is not just loving compassion, but when it goes to that radical extent of insisting that the love of God does not remain contained in God, but spills over again and again and again into all corners of humanity, starting with those who find themselves weak and vulnerable.
Right.
that if you want to claim to love God, you run to the places where there's hurt and there's pain.
Yes.
Right? Rumi has that wonderful story of there was a dragon that was devouring someone. Everyone ran away from them except this one chivalrous soul that ran towards the dragon. And he rescues this poor wounded creature from the mouth of the dragon and brings them to safety. And the wounded soul is so grateful. And he says, how come you ran? Everybody else ran away. And he says, I came because I heard you cry. Then Rumi says, become one of these people, be like water. Water always runs down towards the humble and the lowly. So if we claim to stand in this sacred tradition of radical love, what we are called to do is to always gravitate towards the people who are being crushed by the machinery of the empire, by the machinery of the nation state, by the machinery of exploitation and socioeconomic torture.
Right.
And we're not helpless here. We're not hopeless here. I'm always reminded that so much of anti-colonial struggles were led by Sufis. Whether it is the Tijanis and the Muridis in sub-Saharan Africa, or one of my favorite examples, Omar Mukhtar, who was the Libyan Sanusiya Sufi. And there's that wonderful story from him where the Italians, with their tortured machinery, had killed and beheaded and publicly executed thousands and thousands of Libyans. And then one day in battle, the Libyan liberation forces, who are almost all Sufis, they capture a couple of the Italian soldiers. And the Libyans say, well, let's do to them what they had done to us. Let's hang them publicly, just as they had hung us. And Omar Mukhtar puts his hand out saying, we will not do that to them. And his own soldiers say, but they killed us. They executed us. And Omar Mukhtar's response was, they are not our teachers.
Yes.
We have our teachers. And alhamdulillah, to be Muslim, we have Hazrat Payghambar, we have Hazrat Fatima and Hazrat Khadija, we have Imam Ali, we have Maulana Rumi and Ibn Arabi and both of the Ghazali brothers. We have Iqbal, we have Nizamuddin Awliya. We have this extension of illuminated teachers who light the path that we want to walk. And I will say this, at a time...
And Omid Bhai, Ali Shariati.
And Ali Shariati, and Hans Fanon at the end of his life, and Malcolm, you know, and all the women and men whose love and service is quiet and unknown and in loving and raising their families, but who never make it to the history books. Right? To also shine a light on that. And since we were talking just about the conversation of people who have all kinds of crazy ideas about our beloved prophet. As somebody who is not from Pakistan, but has a deep level of love for Pakistan, I just want to give a little shout out to all of my Pakistani friends. You are heirs to a treasure. There is no place in the world that has had a richer tradition of an effusive and illuminated tradition of love and devotion towards the Prophet Muhammad, right? As somebody who's not an Urdu speaker and is not from Pakistan, my devotional life would not be complete without the Qawalis of Sabri brothers and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And not just Coke Studio versions, which I like also, but to go back to the older ones and to listen not just to Tajdar Haram, but to Ya Muhammad Nur Mujassam. Right? This is your legacy. This is the legacy of Pakistan. That to speak of the Prophet is to speak of embodied light. Nur Mujassam, embodied light. Right?
Absolutely.
And I think if we're thinking about how do we live a life that is imbued with love and justice and beauty in today's world, you in Pakistan don't need lessons from anybody else from anywhere else in the world. You have it in your own tradition. You're sitting on this tradition, on this treasure, to excavate it, to plant it in the seed of your own hearts, and to watch it come to fruition.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Brother Umid. Umid bhai, just the final question that I'll have for you, and it in some ways, throughout this discussion, it has been a running motif. Uh, but just to kind of uh, hit it home, in the minds of not just Pakistani Muslims, but the global ummah, and beyond that, all people, justice and peace seeking individuals throughout the world, because we have the notion of people who are striving for human rights, for justice, and so on, that are come from a faith-based background, and others that are fairly from a secular left background. And of course, I went through the transition to both. And so, uh, uh, and so, what would, in some ways, your message be, particularly, towards the people involved in whether as Muslims, as Christians, as Jews, as Hindus, as Buddhists, and so on? What is the type of resources within their own faith traditions that call upon them in terms of aspiring to a prophetic response to the numerous injustices and cruelties in the world today? What in your opinion, particularly looking at the modern times, the 20th, 21st century, individuals, movements, and so on, that have inspired you and that have also kind of compelled you to kind of think about these things more deeply within your own tradition?
Yeah, thank you, Junaid Bhai, for that. So, to begin with, we know that Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, has a wonderful line in the Bible, you shall know them by their fruit. The measure of a person of faith or a community of faith is not what they call themselves and is not what they profess with their mouth. It is what they do. It's what they do. When someone says, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, I'm a Hindu, I'm an agnostic, I'm an atheist, okay, that's between you and God. I care about what you're doing. I care about where you stand and with whom you stand.
Right.
The rest of it, there's a higher judge sort of for that. But I want to know, in this life, in this world, whose suffering are you alleviating? And there's plenty of people who call themselves Muslim, but they stand with the pharaohs of the world.
Absolutely.
Those are not my sisters and brothers.
Yes.
As far as the people who have inspired me, look, yes, I'm a Muslim, alhamdulillah, and my inspiration does come from the Prophet and the Sufi tradition and the Ali Shariatis of the world, as you said. I take my inspiration from Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan, that God is commanding us to justice and the love tradition, the ihsan tradition, the beauty tradition. What is so lovely about this prophetic imagination of being Muslim is the way in which the love language and the justice language are linked together from the very foundation.
Right.
The best way that I have heard people put this was when I was sitting with one of the closest friends of Martin Luther King, Vincent Harding, who wrote the Riverside Church speech, Dr. King's most radical speech in which he came out against the Vietnam War. And it was as if he was reading the Quran, right? His words, they weren't anything new, but he was affirming something that I had always known in my own heart, which is, he said, when love comes out, we call it justice. Cornel West also says that today.
Yeah.
When love comes into the public, we call it justice. And when it moves inward, we call it tenderness. I think that's what I would love to leave you, Junaid Bhai, and our friends with, is it's easy to speak about justice and social justice, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It has to be a work of love.
Yes.
That you are so concerned about people's well-being and well-doing that you know when you see somebody hurting and vulnerable, that love compels you to do something. And you know that if you don't, then the rocks are going to cry out. That's love. That's the kind of deep compassion that you cannot be a bystander in the suffering of humanity. And the same love which comes through the Sufi tradition and the Islamic tradition and the prophetic dimension of all the religions, the same love that shows publicly as justice inwardly has to show up as tenderness. That the most radically fierce people that we know in confronting systems and institutions and structures of injustice in the world, whether it is rampant capitalism, militarism, Zionism, or whatever, that in terms of how they deal with the people in their own life,
Yes.
they're the most tender people you would see. And people always said this about Malcolm, right? The great Malcolm X, that he would stand in the face of the most racist people on earth, dignified, without flinching. But did you ever see him smile? He had that luminous, tender, radiant smile that would make every heart melt. And sometimes, my John, I do worry that those of us who have spent a lot of decades of our life in struggle and in resistance and in fighting and trying to dismantle the systems of oppression, that we have one MO, and that one MO is fighting.
Right.
And it has a cost for many of our interpersonal relationships, including many of our family lives.
Yes.
No, there's a time to put down the sword and to hug and embrace and cuddle with the ones that you love. And that ability to switch, that ability to speak different languages and know the time for fighting and know the time for tenderness, I think is one of the most precious gifts that the luminous sages of our tradition have to offer us. So may we be people who are simultaneously tender in our interpersonal dealings, loving always, and fiercely just. But just not only so that we can bring down the systems, but so that we can help them to redemption and transformation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor Omid Safi, that was just an amazing, I can say, tour de force in such a concise period of time, giving us these insights into what are the imperatives today for Muslims and all justice-seeking peoples in the world, right in the present conjuncture. I can't thank you enough, Omid Bhai, for joining us and for taking a little bit more time than I had said, but I can guarantee you that all of our viewers today, and I can expect the feedback, and I will certainly convey it to you as well, have just been treated to an exhilarating, performance and such incisive remarks by you that can inspire us to precisely that prophetic tradition, prophetic religion that you speak about, Omid Bhai. So I want to really thank you, Professor Omid Safi, for joining us today for this show, and I hope we can have you back again. I'm sure more and more issues will emerge, and who better to respond to them than yourself. So
Alhamdulillah,
thank
my brother. Thank you so much. Thank you for this time. Thank you for this space. Thank you for the goodness of your heart. And may God make of us a people worthy of being called the people of Muhammad. People worthy of continuing this tradition, which is a living tradition and a flowing tradition. And may God make the lives of people in Pakistan easier and more joyful, and people in the whole region more joyful and filled with dignity and nobility, inshallah.
Wonderful. Ameen. Thank you so much, Omid Bhai, and inshallah, we will certainly have you back again.
Ameen,
Thank you
inshallah.
so
Thank you,
much.
my friend. Khuda Hafiz. Take care.
Okay. Khuda Hafiz. All
Salam.
right, Omid Bhai.